My name is Willis. I'm a staff researcher at the Center for Watershed Sciences. This year I just started my PhD. I'm super excited. I worked for about a decade in the Shasta, and this has been the project that really drew me into science. You know, when you go to school, you always have an idea of what it is you think you're going to do. And when I finished my master's and I got my first job, the offer had this project written into it, and I just said that is exactly what I want to do. And 10 years later, I'm still doing it. A lot of it's because of the support from the Nature Conservancy, so I really appreciate that. But the Riverine canopy, what on earth are we talking about? Well, this project really started because we were trying to understand temperature dynamics in a stream that had no trees, and we wanted to understand the factors that were controlling it. So before we started this project, I should say, I have a number of collaborators over at the Center for Watershed Sciences who work with me. I'm just an engineer, so I'm really sorry. But the ecologists, they'll be talking tomorrow. And then also we have other collaborators at the Nature Conservancy, and then Mike Diaz, who's doing a presentation tomorrow, has been another collaborator of ours. So anyway, so we're talking about a really small stream in the grand scheme of things. We're talking about a 3.6 kilometer tributary to the Shasta River, which is a tributary to the Klamath River, and someplace that a lot of people have been talking about for a long time in terms of its management for a number of species, but in particular coho salmon. And so in 2009, the Nature Conservancy bought this one property, a 4,000-acre ranch that had most of Big Springs Creek flowing through it, and we needed to figure out why it wasn't working and what they could do to improve it. So here's the creek itself. It's a spring-fed stream. There's no snowmelt or rainfall runoff hydrograph, so it's stable. The amount of stream flow it produces is on the order of 80 to 100 CFS. In the summers, it supplies about 80% of the base flow to the Shasta River. And even though this tributary itself is only 3.6 kilometers, the power of the spring-fed temperature signal controls temperatures downstream for tens of kilometers. So by focusing on this really targeted area, there's a disproportionately large response throughout the system as a whole. So that's one of the reasons it's really important. At the time that we were working on this project, Little Springs, another smaller, it's about a mile long spring-fed tributary, wasn't connected, so really we were just focusing on Big Springs. And I think what's notable is that all the action really happens upstream. All the springs, most of the springs come in there, and then you just have all of this space where it flows. And you don't have a lot of factors disturbing it. There's some modest stream flow diversions, but for the most part, the bulk of the discharge comes in below Big Springs Lake, so it's uncontrolled natural flow. And this is what we saw that we thought was weird. My background is in temperature and water management for temperature outcomes, and so I was looking at these temperature signals year after year after year. And in 2009, we saw this weird temperature signal where what was strange about it was temperatures in the Sierra Nevada and Mediterranean streams tend to peak in August and then decline. But in Big Springs, year after year after year, we kept seeing this signal where temperatures were actually peaking in June and then becoming notably cooler as the summer was getting hotter. And we couldn't understand why this is. There are no trees. And so it has a wide geometry. It's relatively, it's not steep, so it goes through some flat lowlands. So we were trying to figure out what it was controlling this. And what we noticed as we started going back through our field data was in the spring, this was taken actually the first year of the project, so about April 2009. In the spring, the stream looked like this. And by September, the stream looked like this. And the first year this happened, we said, of course, because there had been a riparian fence established. There had been in-stream grazing previous to this. And we said, well, this is just a natural response after the first year. But as we came back year after year after year, every spring, the stream looked like that. And every late summer, the stream looked like that. And And so this is when we started paying attention to what was going on in this plant growth cycle and the relationship it might have to temperature. So we monitored a number of factors throughout this project. Fortunately, that included biomass and discharge and stage. And so here's a chart where on the upper graph, we're looking at biomass through the season. You can see the date along the bottom starting in January and going out through August. And so we would take biomass samples and we could see that, they would increase through the season. Well, that makes a lot of sense. But something that we found fascinating was when we also looked at stage and discharge, we noticed that as the season goes on, discharge actually declines. And this makes sense to us even though there's no rainfall runoff component, because there is a lot of groundwater use throughout the region. And so, the possibility that regional groundwater use was affecting, spring-fed volumes, that made sense to us. But what didn't make sense to us right away was why, even though stream flow would sometimes be half of what it was before groundwater pumping would start for the irrigation season, stage would double. And so we started looking at the relationship between biomass and discharge and stage and realized that the plants themselves were acting like a leaky dam. They were just holding back the water and increasing stage, which had the corresponding effect of increasing depths, and so then you had less surface area for heating. So that was something interesting we were looking at. Well, when we knew stage was increasing, we got interested about what might be happening to the velocities through the stream. So we built these high-detailed, high-density velocity profiles, and the way we did this is just like you would take a discharge measurement along the stream, measuring at 6/10 depth. We actually took measurements at each transect at the top of the water column, 2/10, 4/10, 6/10, 8/10 in the bottom of the water column across this throughout the season. And so you can see in March, early season, when there's not a lot of plant growth, you don't have a lot of slow areas of discharge. But later in the season, even though we were having half the flow, we had a lot deeper stages, and we also had this really nice variability of lots of slow patches in the plants and then quick patches in the more open channel. So then we started thinking about, okay, well, if there's this hydraulic effect, what about shade? What are these plants doing for shade? Because they were growing everywhere. Some estimates had it as high as covering about 50% of the water surface. So we went out there with picnic chairs and we just put them in the stream, and we had solar pyranometers, and we set up one under a patch of vegetation and one in open channel, and every hour we would go out and we would take a reading, and we did it once in July and once in August because it kind of took us that long to figure out that this might be important. And so we noticed that in July it was providing substantive shade in the patches of vegetation. We were getting an 84% reduction of solar radiation, and in August that average went even higher to 92. So, when we took it all together, because we really didn't know how important it was, the change from 1 month to the next, we said, okay, well, then the total average percent shade provided by these dense patches of vegetation is 88%. That's still a lot. That's on the order of a full riparian canopy. So we said, well, it's a lot, but what do we do with all this data? How do we prove this concept? And so, of course, being an engineer, I built a model. And this is my model. It's a two-dimensional numerical, it's a predictive model. There's my mesh, and each element in the mesh, I assign, whether it's a patch of aquatic macrophyte, those elements are they're on the scale of meters, not centimeters, so it's a little coarse. Mostly we did that because we wanted to see how coarse a model we can get away with, because all this data takes a long time to collect. And so we said, well, some of these places are bed material, some of these places are macrophytes. There was one little rock berm that you can see in there. We assigned it to each element throughout the model, and then we played around to see, do the plants make any difference at all? And if they do, is it the hydraulic effects that they're having? Is it the shade effects? You know, what role are they really playing here? And here were the results. So the solid black line is the average daily, it's a 7-day average daily maximum water temperature. And we focused on that because since this project was all about coho, because it's all about the fish, if you ask the ecologists they work with, that was the metric they wanted to work I love them, I really do. That's the metric they wanted to move forward with. So we said, okay, well, let's look at this 7-day average daily maximum and see what's going on here. So the black line is observed. That came off of our measured data in the stream. And then all the other lines are my attempt to replicate that with the model using aquatic macrophytes as the driving force here. And so the first thing I did was say, well, let's pretend they don't matter at all. Let's just leave them out and see what we get. And that's the kind of little dotted line. And you can see actually in some portions of the model early in the season and, you know, in about May and June, it didn't do too badly. And then as you got later in the season past July, it just rode right off the rails. It had no resemblance to anything we were observing. So that was an indication that, okay, you know, these are important. But the other thing that it told us that immediately got our interest was we could see the more typical heating pattern we would expect from a stream like this in an area like this, with relative annual peaks happening later in the summer. And so that was something that said, okay, you know, these macrophytes probably are playing an role, but what is it? The next thing we did was say, okay, well, let's pretend like the shade doesn't have a big role to play in this, but it's actually the hydraulics, the deepening and the shortened travel time that is going on that's having a big effect here. And so that's the kind of the darker dashed line. And again, early in the season, we were getting better replication, but then towards the end of the summer, it followed more of the no macrophyte scenario than the actual observed scenario we were seeing. So finally we said, okay, well, let's put it all together and let's put shade into this model as well. And as soon as we said that every macrophyte element in the model had a shade factor associated with it, that's when we really got into the ballpark of what we were actually seeing. And so that's what told us not only that aquatic macrophytes were one of the primary drivers of temperature in the system, but that they were having this really anomalous effect on temperature where as the season was getting warmer, the stream was actually getting cooler. And it was getting cooler with half the flow that it had in the beginning of the season. That was a remarkable finding because, well, I'll get there. But you can still see, actually, I'll show you. The model didn't do that great all the time, though. And one of the things we were developing this model for was to look at water management scenarios and say, okay, you know, we know there are a few diversions, but what if we put that water in stream? What is that doing for temperature? Well, if you're not really replicating temperature well throughout the season, you can't make a determination about the season. So there were periods where you could focus on, and that could give us some guidance, but it wasn't good enough for the kind of decisions we wanted to be making. So the next question was, well, how much more data do you need, and how refined does it have to be? And so that's when we got to start playing with drones. We had a really good time with this. So we took a drone and we started, well, let's do this monthly. Let's see if we go and we fly the drone monthly. We'll do a total aerial survey of the stream. We'll move all that data into GIS and see if we can train the model to recognize patches of vegetation in open water, and then get it to get called into the model so that we don't have to do all of this kind of clunky manual assigning when we're doing our simulations. So we flew the model. We would tie every month. We had gone out and put about 30 targets out there that we had surveyed in. And so every month we would go and we would tie the targets and see each set of photos that we got, so that from month to month we could compare differences in the spatial extent and also the vertical extent of aquatic macrophyte growth. And so we got it refined to within a centimeter. So we feel really good about the spatial resolution of the aerial modeling that we've done with the drone. And here's some of the output. This is just a very small section. So this was actually a flight that we did in May, and we could see, you know, there's some growth. But then when we looked at the same reach resolution, August, a tremendous difference. And so this really convinced us that, not only do we need this improved data resolution, on the time scale that we were modeling, but we also need to have a lot of spatial resolution. And so this is really pushing us into a direction where we're going to use a water temperature model that can actually directly read shape files so that we can get as much precision as possible. But before we do that, we have to train this model to recognize patches of vegetation and patches of open water. So that's what we're working on now. This is one of the sample outputs when we asked it to practice. And so far it's doing pretty well. We haven't processed all of the data yet, and one of the places it's really falling short is where we're asking it to recognize submerged vegetation. It's having a hard time doing that. I think we need a much fancier camera. But as far as getting open or emergent vegetation, it is doing a good job of recognizing that. So we are encouraged. But what is the point? Who cares? Well, one of the things that we find so interesting is that seasonal temperature patterns are strongly influenced by aquatic macrophyte growth. This is important because this macrophyte growth is associated with spring-fed streams, and spring-fed streams are associated with stable flows and cool water. So when we're looking in the future and we're talking about climate change and cold water habitat and where are we going to find resilience, we're going to find it here. And one of the things that makes these so much more important now that we know about the role of plants is plants really recover in a period of months, unlike a riparian canopy that might take decades to establish itself. So now we're not only talking about resilient systems, but we're talking about resilient systems with rapid recovery. And that's really important as we're having shorter and shorter opportunities to address some of the ecological problems we have. The modeling, so a lot of these projects are driven by modeling analysis and output, and how refined do these models need to be? Well, more refined than just binary pre-season growth, post-season growth. That's one of the things we're finding. We haven't really determined whether monthly is a good representation or not. I'm hoping it is. But that is another question that we need to resolve. And finally, profound implications for water management decisions and conservation strategies. This is really where I think the big takeaway comes from, because again, when you think about how we're typically managing these streams, we're managing for what we think are supposed to be late season impairments. But if we're looking at a stream like this that has a lot of value for cold water habitats, if we're focusing on this August period, we're missing the boat. The problem is happening months earlier in June, May, when we're seeing these annual peaks. But the other thing that's interesting about this is the ways that you would manage these streams changes through the season because they are so dynamic. So for example, one of the things we found is people are really focusing on in-stream flows and putting water back into streams. And it turns out in a system like this, that really works well early in the season when there isn't a lot of cover because you want a lot of water so that it's harder to heat up quickly. But late in the season, once you have this canopy established, adding water from people's water rights or diversions actually does almost nothing to water temperatures. And so now you're in a situation where if you're working in a stream that has some sort of diversion or human use associated with it, the answer doesn't have to be a total exclusion of human water use anymore. There's this place of reconciliation where you can say, early in the season, there are critical periods and we really need you to work with us. But later in the season, we have a lot of flexibility and what you're doing isn't really having a great effect. So, what can we work out here? And considering how much of, not just California, but the nation's waterways are in private lands and affected by human use, finding these kinds of solutions are going to be what has the biggest effect on most of these ecosystems. And so we have had tons of funding from lots of groups: Nature Conservancy, California Trout, Bureau of Reclamation, State Water Resources Control Board, National Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, Wildlife Conservation Board. We've been working with Nature Conservancy, California Trout, Watercourse. It's really been a wonderful project, and we recently got a grant to keep going for another 3 years, so we're looking forward to some great outcome. Thank you.